I've heard you say that usually stories for you begin at the ending, and then you're trying to figure out how we get there. That if you have the ending clear in your mind, you can work backwards from it. So I have a few questions about this. But the first is, what exactly, in terms of the ending, was clear in your mind when you sat down to write this film?
There was a sort of mess of things, in truth, just like there's a mess of things in the ending, I suppose. But there was one thing in particular which was about a very young, very inexperienced photojournalist who, for reasons which are as much to do with naivety as anything else, wants to be a war photographer. That's their goal. And at the very, very end, what that photographer would do is capture one of those iconic photos that very good press photographers, or just photographers in general, but also war photographers, can sometimes grab, that become an image that you would imagine in 20 years' time people would still be referencing. So it might be a soldier sort of falling down in the being shot actually in the Spanish Civil War, or a monk setting themselves on fire for the Vietnam War, or a flag being raised over Iwo Jima, or just these things that become seared in our minds, which in some respects is the job of a photojournalist, not to always be iconic, but to sometimes capture that thing. And so it would be the story leading up to that shot, which I saw as the shot that you see, as it were, in a developing bath when the film is over.
How do you know when to stop going backwards? Particularly with this film, how did you know to start as the war was beginning to wind down? And did you ever think about going further back?
I'm not sure if you'd call it themic or political reasons, but I worked with some assumptions, and one of the assumptions, many assumptions, one of the key assumptions was that people know what is going wrong. Some people may not consciously know what is going wrong. When I say going wrong, I mean what is going wrong in specifically America in this instance. Polarization and division is an objective truth. It's not really open to debate that it exists, but what are the underlying reasons for it? That is to say, historical reasons or current reasons, I think basically people know. And it's not really to do with where they sit on a political divide. I think many of these things are at least semi-objective as well. So in terms of where you stop, in a funny way, the great truism of writing is that writing is editing, writing is cutting, which is certainly the case. Partly, I'm always looking for what is not required as much as what is required, because of a function, which is to give a space where the audience steps into, in a sense.
So carrying on with thinking about your writing process, as I was preparing for this discussion, I realised that after I watch your work, usually, in fact, almost always, I will say something along the lines of, I've never seen anything like that before. And that can't be an accident. And it got me wondering, to what extent does a desire to innovate drive you when you sit down to write a script?
Oh, not at all. Not intentional. No, honestly, not intentionally. I think if you one thing you could say is there's a thing about film. Film is a mass market space. And quite often, most of the films that people are aware of are fantastically expensive, and they require certain levels of audiences. And if you step outside that space, I'm not talking about you because I know that's not true of you, but in general, you'd be quite likely to come across things you haven't seen before. The things that you see again and again and again, and there are many things that we do see again and again and again, that is a function of the process of making that kind of film.
It's fascinating. Just the idea that that it's not even on your radar, and your work is what your work is.
No, that it would be much too self-conscious to do that. I think that would be too self-aware. Actually, it's much more straightforward. I said I start with the ending. That's sort of true, but it's also not true. That's at the end of a gestation period. The gestation period is just being interested in something. So I got very interested in the idea that Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post, they broke a story as reporters that removed a corrupt president. Before the end of Nixon's term of office, they got rid of him. And I was thinking, would that happen now? And I was thinking, no, it clearly wouldn't happen now, because we have seen it not happen now. And why is that? What's going? So there's that. There's polarization. There's populist politics. There's the reasons how we've got here and where it might lead. Does it lead to fascism? If you remove checks and balances and erode the fourth estate, do you lead to fascism? Is that what happens? And so there's a whole bunch of thoughts that then crystallize as an ending, which is another way of saying a story.
So, sticking with the way that you think and this idea of innovation, because your work is very innovative. One of the really innovative things about this film that I love is the way that in certain action sequences you will insert a still image, and it's an image that's being captured by one of the characters at that time. And I'd love for you to talk about where this idea came from, what some of the things...
You're not going to like this answer.
Oh, no. Okay.
You're not going to like it. It's a really old technique, belongs to certain kind of 70s and 80s movies about photojournalists. They would often interrupt the flow of the story with a still frame. There is something nice about it. You know, cineasts, 24 frames a second, you are actually seeing still frames, but they move forward so quickly that they look moving and all that sort of fun sort of stuff, and then you are interrupting that. So there's something elegant in that idea, but honestly, there's quite a few movies I could reel off. They're just forgotten, maybe. I mean, or I hadn't forgotten them because I ripped them off, but I always liked it. I always thought it was a nice thing. You'd hear you know, old days, 35mm stills film camera, and you'd hear that that sort of mirror flip inside the camera, and then hold it, and there'd be a little moment of silence. It would just give you the thing that a still photograph gives you, which is different from a moving image. It's like a moment to think or absorb, and then you're back off it. Yeah, old trick, sorry.
No, I have heard you talk about how you were kind of going back to those old way of war photography, and
filmmaking.
Yeah,
very.
But it's certainly not something that we see in action sequences these days.
Sure, but that would be because of the other space that exists within cinema, which is that mainstream one. In fact, interestingly, or potentially interestingly, to you guys, in film construction, there are some things that are subtly oppositional to very mainstream filmmaking, and one of them, they're very subtle, but one of them you see right at the very end, where you have some soldiers fighting their way through a corridor who, most of those guys were veterans and Navy SEALs, or one was a Marine, so moving towards the Oval Office. And all that stuff they did was unscripted. They would just, their note was just do your thing, just do what you would do to get from this space to that space. And then we shot it. And in the edit, it was interesting when I showed film people the edit who belonged maybe to the more mainstream world. They said, you've got to take out all of these silences, or it keeps being stop, start, stop, start. That is the grammar of a normal action sequence, which has a you know, often very elegant flow to it, and something propulsive that doesn't give you a chance to sort of, there's nothing staccato really. If there is something staccato, there'll be some score under it which will carry you through those moments, or whatever the technique might be. And this film is deliberately going against those things. So time compressions are not made; they're left in, that kind of stuff. That's nerdy.
No, that's great. It's yeah. I actually asked that question because my background is in cognitive film theory, and
You have to unpack that.
I was very interested in the impact that it'll have on the viewers' brains as they're watching those sequences. But that's another thesis for me.
Well,
I think.
subjective, presumably.
Yeah.
Subjective response.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. So I wanted to talk about music because Jeff Barrow and Ben Salisbury, you've worked with on all of your films, as well as for your TV show Devs.
Yeah.
And music is obviously integral to a film, but particularly with your work, when I think about the score and the images, they're so inextricably linked in my mind. Could you talk about how you work with Jeff and Ben and what that process is like?
Well, so Jeff and Ben Salisbury came from a kind of nature documentary background, actually. And Jeff Barrow was in a band, or a couple of bands, drummer and producer and various things. So they didn't have film grammar, actually, of the sort I was just talking about. I'm always interested by people in film who don't have film grammar. So if you, this is cheapening the work of some film composers in a way that's not really fair, but it's a sort of general point. You got a car chase or you get a helicopter and you say, we want this scored. And what they'll do is, in effect, give less attention to that moment because they know that a helicopter noise or a revving car engine will be drowning it out. And so you'll end up being delivered some restless strings or something like that. And Jeff and Ben did not have that background, and they approached everything in a kind of egalitarian way where they just looked at the film and would think about what was right for what moment in a kind of usefully not as a pejorative thing, in a naive way, really not pejorative at all. As well as that, we would have an unusual way of working, and I think this is true with most of the crew I work with. Departments are not very split up. There's a lot of interdepartmental communication and conversation. Jeff and Ben, as composers, would get the script way before we shoot it, and then often would visit the set while it was being shot. So, and then obviously we talk about the score they're composing, but we also talk about needle drops, as in soundtrack, bits of music. So it's just a holistic, rolling conversation, starts very early, ends right at the end, and that is true across the board with the large number of filmmakers I regularly work with.
That's not surprising to hear that they're involved from so early a point.
Everybody is. I sound designer. Everybody gets the script as early as possible, and I'm just about to stop doing this fucking job, but for years and years and years, while I've been doing Q&As or interviews or whatever it is, I've been trying to be anti-auteurist and draw attention to departments, heads of departments, because it really, I used to be a novelist more than 20 years ago. I wrote books. You write books on your own. That is authorship. You don't make films on your own. You make them with a very large group of people, and they have significant voices. People don't fight over DOPs when they're crewing up. because the DOP then just slavishly follows the director's vision. Clearly, they're bringing something. Manifestly, they're bringing something. So
I've heard you highlight your set designer,
I credit them. I put them in the cards. So like, yeah, Mish does props. She comes up with so many ideas that I get credited for. The stunt coordinator, Jeff Dashnor, in there. A lot of what you're seeing is a stunt coordinator's work. I could go on, but broadly, it's collegiate, it's collaborative. That's the best thing about film.
And just digging into that ways of working, that idea of the way that you work, I've heard you say that you don't do a shot list and you don't pre-block, and you had 2 weeks of rehearsals with the actors. And I'd love to hear a bit about how the combination of those things led to some of the key moments.
Well, so to row back slightly on what I just said, there are auteurs. Wes Anderson's an auteur, clearly. You can just see when you're looking at his films. I'm just separating myself from that. Similarly with shot lists, actors are basically like production designers or DOPs. If I arrive with a shot list, I have imagined a shot where this is the scene, but I've imagined that I stand up and walk over to that side of the stage to get some flare off that red light or whatever it is, and then the actor says, I think I'd just stay seated, I wouldn't really walk over there. Then you've sort of interrupted something, and I would rather start the shooting day by rehearsing with the actors and finding out what they themselves feel motivated to do in the blocking. Usually they know what they want to do in the blocking, and if they don't, then it's just a discussion. At that point, you bring in the crew and you do a lineup, and they show the scene to the crew, so everybody gets a sense of what's happening that day. I have, in many movies, in many big television show over many years, I've literally never found a scene that you then struggle to figure out how to shoot. There's always a way. So what's the shot list for? Now, it would be for a kind of director who includes a different kind of grammar in their filmmaking. So that might make sense. There may be a themic reason why you want a developing shot that starts on a close-up, turns into a two-shot, and then becomes a mid. There may be a reason for that, but that just isn't what I am doing in filmmaking, so unnecessary.
And following on from that, I've heard you talk about your favourite shot in the film. And it's
what did I say? I would have just been, if you tested me now, I'd edit something different.
You spoke really, really nicely, and it was just a fantastic bit of info for me about it's the scene where Wagner Mora is screaming silently, and a tank just rolls behind him.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk about it here and kind of tell the story of how that shot happened.
Well, yes. So film, this is a bit like leaving space for an audience. I also tried it by not having shot lists in part. I tried to leave space within a shooting day for things that are spontaneous or just occur to you in the moment or are an experiment, because something can flow from that. If that is the sort of filmmaker you are, things can flow from that. So in that particular instance, consciously, unconsciously, I'm hunting for something that represents what this guy feels about the death of this other journalist, old colleague. I'm looking for that. I know I've got a scene where he's kind of expressing a kind of angry frustration, but a lot of that frustration is partly about the death, but it's also about that the death is futile because they're not going to get the scoop they wanted, which is to do with what can be a motivating force for journalists, which is, in a way, ambition. And I was thinking that's just not internal enough. And we had all these tanks, all this hardware, they kicked up a lot of dust. And just said to Wagner, "Could you just scream out into this lake?" And he said, because of Samia or something like that. I said, "Yep, exactly." He said, "Yeah, give me a minute." He needed to psych himself up, smoked a fag, went down the shore while we swung a lens out over the water to look back and just grabbed it. And the whole thing probably took, I'm going to guess, 35 minutes, because you're moving so fast on these days. You can't, it's not, we're not getting 4 setups a day like a really big movie, or 6. We're getting like 30 or 35 or more sometimes. So just grabbed it, and and then it become, it interests me how often a spontaneous decision ends up being useful later, which also feeds into no shot lists.
Yeah, because it's such a memorable moment in the film. So I loved hearing you talk about that. So before I open it up to the audience, I did just want to ask about Jesse Plemons, because I've heard Kirsten Dunst talking about how he came to be involved in the film. Jesse Plemons plays the terrifying man in the pinkish reddish glasses, and I would love to hear about how he came to be involved from your perspective.
Well, it's a sort of anecdote, really, but short. There was another actor, guy I'd worked with before, thought he'd be great for this. He said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And then for various reasons, he dropped out right before principal photography. So we were at the rehearsal stage, and I spoke to him on the phone, and I was obviously very polite and said, no, of course, that's fine, and hung up and felt really worried because it was a big scene, and walked into the rehearsal room and said, I thought I'd better tell the actors because they're expecting this guy to turn up, and now he's not going to turn up. And Kirsten just said, oh, well, Jessie should do it. She's married to him. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, I'll just text him. And that was basically it. Yeah. No disrespect to the other actor, there's some film phrase which I never quite, it's like falling upwards or something like that. Not upwards, sideways. It was very good anyway, it worked out.
Yeah, it's shocking to hear that, because he is so incredible in this role.
Well, he's just a flat out, really good actor. I mean, actually, so the ending of the film Annihilation, if you know that was hard to write, because part of the function of a script is not just to have ideas, but also put them in a form that can be conveyed. So someone reading the script will be able to get what you're saying, which in something which is inherently hallucinogenic is kind of tricky. But there's another function of a script, which is to get the film financed. So you have to be, there's a tension. And the balance between it working for crew and cast and not putting off a financier was complicated. Well, I'm going to say 2 things. One is that I was just talking with my dad on the way down here, actually, and the world has been in the most appalling situation, and at this moment is in a terrible situation, with particularly Ukraine and Gaza are clear focal points, but there are others too, and there's also polarized politics. But it just feels like there might be a chance that there's a coming to senses on the horizon. Maybe I'm saying that because I'm British, and it feels like that's about to happen here. But that may be broader, that people have looked into the abyss and are going to pull back from the abyss, possibly. So just because of your timeline, I'm older than you, you might be very pessimistic, and but there's some light on the horizon, possibly. But in terms of when how it affected me a lot, because there'd been a Trump presidency which shone a light on how strange things had got. If you remembered, as I remembered eras when politicians would have to resign over saying certain kinds of things or would become unelectable for saying certain kinds of things. That had clearly just gone. The press had lost their ability to hold politicians to account in the way they need to be held into account. And we'd had almost 4 years of it at that point, and it was very, very odd. It was very strange. Then COVID happened. I got sick right at the beginning of COVID, and I got really quite, fairly ill. And when I came out of that, sort of sickness throws you into sort of narcissistic state where you're only aware of yourself in a funny kind of way. So it's a sort of crappy thing to say, but it's sort of true. And when I popped out of it at the other end, things had got so strange. Yeah, fucking idiot talking about injecting bleach. It was hard to believe, really, really hard to believe. And things like, I'm left wing, but when I think of left wing, I think of like whether you believe in a free market or how you think taxation should be spent. I don't think about whether you wear a mask or not. That doesn't seem to me an ideological issue, but somehow it had become one. And there was something about getting sick, waking up and finding how strange everything was on the other side of being sick that I do think influenced me. Yeah.
And Alex, I actually wanted to ask, because I know that you wrote the film before January 6th happened, but principal photography started afterwards, about over a year afterwards.
Oh, much more than a year, yeah.
And I wondered how much, if at all, that impacted you when you were making the film.
If you throw your mind back to 4 years ago or 6 years ago or 8 years ago, which is when really strange rhetoric began to appear from politicians, the kinds of stuff they would say and do. One of the things that I felt you used to hear a lot was very reasonable commentators saying, violent language leads to violent action. Stop using words like this. Stop phrasing sentences like this because it will lead to violence. And that has been proved many, many times. And so when January the 6th rolled around, it was very shocking, but it was also very unsurprising. It was an exact product of that conversation. So it did not motivate anything in the film because it was pre-motivated. However, it did add a kind of injection of anger. And I sort of got in trouble, sort of, whatever the fuck that means, but sort of talking about this film, refusing to condemn right-wing voters. But it's because I don't condemn right-wing voters. You could vote right-wing because you grew up in a right-wing family. That could be the beginning and end of your voting preferences. So I sort of wanted to separate myself from that. But at the same time, I did feel very angry about January the 6th, and I noticed that right-wing crew on the film, American crew and left-wing crew, felt in a way equally angry, that you were not necessarily a supporter of January the 6th just simply by your voting preference. And so it was a motivator in anger, I would say. It was never the intention. I always saw myself as a writer. I wrote this film, Ex Machina, and I was very worried about some scenes, the way they could get changed if the director saw them a slightly different way. And some of them were dialogue scenes, and some of them, actually it was to do with things like, there's quite a lot of nudity in Ex Machina, and I had a whole set of thoughts attached to that. And so my initial, it was really a kind of a protective act of the script rather than trying to be a director. And if you were to analyze my films, you'd see they're quite basic, quite often in terms of the direction. So if I'm shooting a scene, you will very often see a master, a couple of mids, a couple of close-ups, maybe dirty, maybe clean, but that's kind of the scene, pretty much. And I then wrote Annihilation. I thought, oh yeah, I've got to do this one because this is too weird at the end. And so it became a sort of enforced thing. But you know, I've got to know a couple of directors. I've worked with other directors. Typically, directors love being on set. That's what they really, really love. And what I love is writing and being in the edit, actually. That's the bit I really enjoy. And there's something very performative about directing. And the part of me that's a writer doesn't want to be performative or performing. And it wasn't a natural space for me ever. And I was sort of looking for an out. And I thought, every film I did, I sort of approached it as an atheist in a way, and thinking could easily be the last thing I ever do, so I better just go for it. I'm just going to fucking go for it. And then with this thing, I thought, no, I'm really going for it. And I thought that's a good time to stop. There could be a time in the future where I think, I've written something and I think, actually now I want to protect this again. But actually at the moment, I'm more interested in the opposite, which is leaning into the collaboration side and being interested in what a director will do rather than annoyed by what a director will do. So that, yeah. They certainly can, for sure, but they don't have the traction and the impact that they used to have. And part of that is because some news organizations on the left and the right have abandoned impartiality to such a massive degree that they're essentially propagandists. And one of the odd things about propaganda is that it clearly doesn't work on the people who disagree with the propaganda, but in a funny way, it doesn't entirely work on the people who do agree with the propaganda, because people kind of know propaganda when they hear it. So they accept it because they want it, but they don't trust it. And that hurts public trust in the media, and I would include the left and the right in that, because it's to do with abandoning impartiality and embracing bias. As well as that, they've been brutally attacked by politicians who've deliberately undermined them for obvious reasons, so that they can't be held to account. And it all exists now in social media, the context of social media. The Washington Post did not have to compete with Twitter or X, whatever. They didn't have to. There wasn't a cloud of distrust around their statements. There was actually a cloud of trust. So, but can they still have an effect? Yes, of course they can, for sure, because in some ways the collapse of Boris Johnson, it was his own doing in all sorts of ways, but it was reported on, it was disseminated. So it didn't have the immediate cause and effect of Watergate, but it still fucked him.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask this question because your work makes me feel really excited about cinema, and equally your TV work makes me really excited about TV. And I wanted to ask you, as a filmmaker, what is some work that makes you really excited about cinema or about TV? I've heard you talk a bit about Anatomy of a Fall.
Well, Anatomy of a Fall is a great example. I mean, I felt I was being treated as an adult when I watched it. You know, I wasn't being patronized. It was stunning performances, quite extraordinary, and just good films. But that's an obvious example. On a plane, I watched The Expendables 4, and I enjoyed that too. So. I got no pushback, but that's because of who I was working with. So if at a different sort of filmmaking distributing entity, it's not just there to be pushback. They would never have financed this film. Just never, never, never. They wouldn't. It wouldn't have come down to the execution. It would have been in its totality. But it's an independent American film financier, A24. They are not risk averse, and they have understood that there are markets for unusual films, and they embrace that. And I think actually not just that, they pride themselves on it, which means it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. But for what it's worth, I do know that one of the two bosses of A24 got an email from a studio head on the first weekend it came out, actually rather generously acknowledging, saying nothing in this film should have worked in the marketplace, not one thing. And so good job for backing it, you know.